Marketer of the Day, episode 765. Done for you podcasting. Supercharge your podcast using video, social media, and personal communication.
Hey, this is Robert Plank from DFYpodcast.com, and I want to talk to you specifically about your biggest goals, your biggest hopes and dreams, which I assume include you and your podcast and making your podcast a success. And if you're like a lot of people, you've hit some bumps in the road, you've had a lot of uncertainty about a lot of things that maybe don't matter in the grand scheme of things, like equipment and the format of your show. And a terrifying statistic is that the average podcast dies after 6 episodes. Only 6. But there's also the other reassuring statistic that 83% of your listeners will listen to all the podcast content you put out. So the simple solution for where you're stuck right now is to keep moving, to keep going forward. But I understand if you are stuck or discouraged, or maybe your podcast hasn't quite panned out in the way that you've expected, and that's okay. And I have some ideas for you to reinvigorate your podcast and get what you want out of it, which can change, right? A lot of people out there, they have this idea of getting millions of listeners, thousands of episodes. They sell sponsorships and just make $20,000 a day putting out an episode a day. Isn't it that easy? Well, you might have found that maybe the traffic numbers did not quite match up to that, and that many people with huge podcasts, they leave out that they run tons of paid ads, they have tons of money to burn, huge lists, huge traffic, they regularly drop $30,000, $40,000 on a sponsorship on another podcast just to get their massive numbers and kind of keep the shell game going. So don't compare yourself to these big, huge, mega podcasters. There's a lot going on behind the scenes with them that you do not see, that you do not know about, but there are still ways for you to make money with your podcasting, from the networking, the joint venturing, and even maybe going for more of a proof of concept mindset. Proof of concept mentality, which might mean that if you are not selling sponsorships on your show for $500, $1,000, what if you did something crazy? What if you sold an ad on your show for $100, $200, and you guarantee placement on the next 15 or 20 episodes of your show, which I know is not the millions of dollars you expected, but it's a proof of concept. You can prove that it's possible for you to sell an ad to your audience. And after you can show the ad in place and you can show some results, you follow up back with that person who placed the ad, follow up with new people. So there's all kinds of ways that you can just prove on a small scale that something works. And then you can ramp up or decide what you do not like, what you do like. And I think that's a much healthier way of looking at your podcast stats and looking at your download numbers. And so that brings me to the first thing I want to tell you about your podcast, which is, number 1, post consistently. Like we said, the average podcast dies after 6 episodes, and I guarantee that most of those people who experienced the pod fade did not expect their show to die that quickly. But it's one of those things that happens where we start off with the best of intentions, but we don't set real goals. We don't set ourselves up for success. We don't dedicate real time every week to create our new episode. So my advice to you is, if you're one of those people that stuck around the 6 episode mark, create more episodes and don't get yourself overwhelmed. Don't plan your next 50 episodes. Plan your next 1 or 2. In fact, can you put out 1 this week or 1 later today? Expand your runway. That way you have a pool of content that's dripping out over time. So, I mean, how good would it feel if you had the next handful of episodes done? So every week or every month, you just had content coming out, whether you felt like creating something new or not. And if you're stuck about ideas for a new episode, think about someone that you could have on your show, that you could interview, not necessarily for you to buy from them or them to buy from you, but someone that just is your friend, someone that you want to make look good and talk up, and someone where you want to seem smart for finding this guest for your audience, with the idea that maybe it'll pay off later, maybe not, but if you can get a friend who is in your space or adjacent to your space that you can show your audience to, then maybe they can return the favor at some point. And even if you're the kind of person that you're an introvert or you don't have any good guests to bring on your show, consider situational advice. Right? It's easy to try to come up with 10 real estate facts, but who is that really going to help? But what if you said, say you had a real estate podcast and you said, here is the situation you find yourself in. You're on an up market and you're wondering if it's time to sell your house or not, or is buying or renting better, or you just consider a situation that maybe someone you know is in, or someone that you've met in the past had been in, or you even think of a hypothetical situation. But this makes for kind of entertaining podcast content, right? Instead of just talking about the dry facts and figures, you start with a real problem, a real situation, a real starting point, and then you explain the problem that they have, you explain some tools and solutions, and maybe develop a little bit of a plan to getting out of it. And what's great about that way of thinking is that your podcast episode can be as short or as long as you want, right? If someone wanted to know how to deal with a problem tenant that they're renting a house to, you can talk about that for 5 minutes, or you could talk about that for 40 minutes and have 2 case studies. Think about a possible resource you could recommend, and that on its own could be a podcast episode. Think about the podcast equipment or the podcast tools or the tool in your industry. Again, going back to the real estate example, is there a website or a software tool that someone can use to find properties for sale or get alerts for properties for sale, figure out like what a good neighborhood is or something like that. But just think about that. Is there a tool, a book, or a website that you could make a quick episode about? And if it's been a long time since you've updated your podcast, even 5 or 10 minutes will do. You don't have to hit the ground running and create a bunch of stuff, bringing your podcast back to life. Just 5 or 10 minutes talking about a website that really helped you. For example, I like Calendly, which is great for setting up office hours when you have a meeting or a podcast guest. They can choose what time to meet with you, and it saves a lot of back and forth. I could talk for 10, 20 minutes about Calendly. And my advice to you about getting this done is to put weekly time on your calendar. Say every Friday morning from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. is just devoted to your podcast. And even if you say, well, I'm not really in the mood, I don't feel like these days to record, it doesn't matter. Just set aside Friday, 9 to 10 a.m., even if it's just an hour every Friday morning, to think about your podcast. Don't do anything else. Don't check Facebook, email, do any other tasks. Set aside that chunk of your calendar just to at least think about your podcast in the future. And maybe you'll feel like squeezing in a quick recording in there. Piece of advice number 2, get guests on your podcast. Let go of the idea that only you have the best advice, and it sucks. It's tough to let go of your ego, but it's your job to make someone else look good. And think about any like musician or a performer or like famous person who kind of had their way up and then they were past their prime and then they were on their way back down. And the famous celebrities that have adapted, that have pivoted, have kind of networked and talked up other people. And I mean, you can apply this to like politicians, things like that too. The most successful politicians eventually pivoted to helping others who came after them. And the way to think about your podcast, perhaps, is to think about your podcast not about content, but about traffic, right? It's easy to say that you will post your podcast episode about house hacking, and you'll say, well, I'm creating good content about house hacking. Perhaps a better way is to think about this in terms of traffic, that if someone is looking for advice about house hacking, they did a Google search, a YouTube search, they looked on Facebook, maybe they saw an ad that brought them to your podcast episode, where then maybe they did learn a few things, but they were then sent via you mentioning a URL, or maybe they got on your list, or you mentioned something else, and now that drives them to a solution. And anyone that you would have as a guest on your podcast, whether they're an author, speaker, coach, expert, whatever they're selling, they need more traffic, and they need to use your network to get eyeballs on what their offer is, but it's a two-way street. Because if you had someone on your podcast who is talking about making money on the stock market and you could refer people there, well then now whenever someone new searches this guest's name or the name of this guest's product, maybe they will find your podcast. And I don't need to tell you that your podcast already has a lot of search engine optimization advantage, especially from these keyword searches, because if you only had a blog with 10 episodes or 10 blog posts, that would only be 10 ways someone can find you. And that's a lot of work, right? Writing 10 whole articles. But if you found 10 people that over time, they met with you on a Zoom call, right? Video conferencing, you just click the record button and you have a recording. Now, 10 interviews is easy. 10 interviews takes a lot less time than 10 blog posts, but it gets even better because you rank for the terms those people mentioned, their name, their product, and you can always follow up with them and get them to promote to their people because they appeared on your show as a guest. You can tag them on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. So do you see how it's a lot more exciting to think about your podcast as traffic, not just cranking out the facts and the figures? And by the way, if you need a podcast created, set up, our website is dfypodcast.com. And in particular, the service that we provide that we're the most excited about is podcast notes, which means that you said what you wanted to say, you got the words out, maybe you had a guest on, and we can listen to them and basically create a text post for you, where underneath the audio player, there's text about the talking points, key quotes, links, URLs, and these are things that can be reused in a number of interesting ways, like tweets and graphics on Facebook, which we'll get into in a moment. But think about using your podcast for traffic instead of content. Now, here's piece of advice number 3, which is less scary than it used to be, which is to get on video, get on Zoom. Maybe 5-10 years ago, it was a little nervous, a little nerve-wracking thing to do because you are raw, you're honest, you might mess up a little bit. But to be honest, everyone's on video these days, especially now that phones are fast enough, the internet's fast enough, the pandemic gave everything a little bit of a shot in the arm. So I'm just talking to you on a Logitech HD web camera, and then I have some soft lights up above. I have a ring light behind my computer. I'm talking into a Samsung C01U condenser microphone. And then when I interview someone, I have these basically knockoff AirPods. This is a Pasonomi brand. They're called X9 Pasonomi, $35 on Amazon. And then this is the charging case. And then you just have these 2 Bluetooth earbuds, and they sync with any modern computer. And if you're the kind of person that, I've been meaning to do more of my podcast interviews, like from the couch on the phone, like with a stand or something. But I'm pretty sure your earbuds, they'll pair with your phone and you can do your Zoom interview that way. But on any computer manufactured in the last 5 years or so, you can pair your earbuds with your computer's Bluetooth, and you don't have to have the big cans or the cords hanging down. You just pair these with your computer and get on video, get on Zoom. And if you're still nervous, if you're still like, well, I need to put my face on, I need to kind of, smooth out the shirt, or I'm not sure about the lighting around my room. I've had plenty of podcast guests just be on video, be on camera, be on their laptop from a coffee shop. And even if you're too nervous to put out the video format of your podcast, well, I would say, first of all, work up to that. But even if you're still an audio only person, at least get on camera for the benefit of your guest. Because if you're only on the audio, if it's like talking on the phone, you'll kind of talk over each other sometimes. It'll be awkward. You might interrupt your guest if they're not finished speaking, or vice versa. Video is so much better because you can just somehow tell from the body language if you should continue down this line of discussion. You can somehow tell when they're done breathing that they're done talking. So get on video, if nothing else, then for their body language. But if you can get on video, so advice number 3 was get on video, get on Zoom, save the recording, just use their built-in recording format. And this makes podcasting a lot easier, because it used to be and you have to learn all this software and all this hardware. And we do have a course about that at podcastcrusher.com. But what we would prefer you do is be computer literate just enough to be on a Zoom call, be on video, and then give us the recordings. Contact us at the contact tab in dfypodcast.com. And we would love to take a dump of your podcast episodes and get them edited, get the audio equalized, add music, reduce noise, add whatever bumpers or commercials, and just log into your account and upload it and schedule it all. And we would love to write some podcast notes. That way you can pick up on all of these search engine benefits. Because if you think about it, creating a ton more content might and probably is not the answer for you, right? The answer is probably getting more eyeballs and attention to your existing content and your new content. And that brings us to advice tip number 4, which is to post your podcast to additional platforms. Did you know that you can post your podcast on iHeartRadio, on Spotify, on SoundCloud, on so many different platforms, and you don't have to do hardly any extra work, right? You put in the time of recording your 10, 20-minute podcast episode, now post it to these other channels, especially places like Facebook, especially places like LinkedIn, and especially YouTube. There are so many podcasts that I'm not really a subscriber to on the iTunes side or the Apple Podcast side, but I find them on YouTube sometimes. This is really easy content, especially if you are on video. But if you're not on video, there are ways around that as well. If you only have an audio podcast, we can take the title graphic or make one for you and put it as just a still graphic, and it plays the audio through, and it's just a still image, but someone can still listen to you on YouTube, subscribe to your YouTube channel, play through the YouTube playlist of your podcast. So many possibilities. And the idea here is that not everyone has seen your existing podcast content. And even when you post something new, there's no guarantee that the whole world will see it. So it's really important that you re-promote at least one old episode per week. Tip number 5, re-promote at least one old episode per week. And this can be something simple like take the link, put it on Twitter. Take the link, put it on your Facebook wall, page, or group. Or if you want to be a little more advanced, send an email blast. You should be building an email list, which means that on your website somewhere, there is a form where someone can fill out their name and email address and get on your email list. And if you've heard of services like Aweber, MailChimp, Constant Contact, Infusionsoft, Entreport, if any of those ring a bell, these are ways that people can join your email list. And maybe for something exciting, maybe not just for a weekly newsletter, because that's old, that's boring. But what's more interesting is a free gift. What's more interesting is a bonus audio or video or a one-page PDF or a checklist, a worksheet. And if you have an email list, I mean, people still read email, and guess what? A lot more people buy from email than from Facebook. You think of a good reason why someone would want to listen to your podcast episode, and maybe think about what problem the podcast episode solves. Maybe like make a bullet point of just what the problem is, a bullet point just of what the solution is, and a bullet point of something specific or like a hidden nugget or treasure inside that podcast episode, and a quick sentence saying, click this link right now and listen to the podcast episode. It can and it should be that simple. Tip number 6, get your podcast notes created. I almost said get your podcast notarized. That doesn't make much sense. But have someone like me and my team at dfypodcast.com listen to your podcast episode and figure out the most important talking points. And keep in mind that this is not a transcript, because here's the problem with podcasting is you have that really great interview, right? And it lasted 60 minutes and you had Tony Robbins or Oprah on or someone similar. And there was so many good things talked about. But when someone finds this, there's just an audio button, an audio player, and they have to listen and scroll through to find all the good nuggets. And then you might have thought, well, okay, I'll just go get it transcribed, right? Well, here's the problem though. How much will that transcript cost to get a 1 hour audio transcribed? I mean, $90, $100, and then it'll be 9,000 words and someone has to scroll all the way through, and it doesn't even sound that great because it's coming from speaking words. What's better is if our team was to listen to that 1 hour episode and come up with about 600 or 700 words, maybe a page and a half of all the important points, including timestamps. So if something if you were talking to a self-help expert and they were talking about mindfulness meditation at 8 minutes and 30 seconds, and maybe at 15 minutes they change subjects, well, you can have text and you can say 8 minutes, 30 seconds, just go right there, and now you can jump to just that section. And what's really great about things like podcast notes is that you can rank for specific keywords, key phrases. If someone is talking about all sorts of self-help aspects and they talk about stress management, mindfulness, stillness, anxiety, any of these keywords, self-care, well, then now those are in your podcast notes. And now when someone searches that on a platform like Google, then that is a new path someone can take. If they search self-care, or maybe say someone prefers podcasts, they can search self-care podcast. And because you took the extra step, the extra effort to have our team at dfypodcast.com create your podcast notes, now that is a new bang for your buck as far as your podcast. It's cheaper than getting a transcript made. It's more user-friendly and manageable, and it works out a lot better than a big old rough transcript, which you may have tried. Podcast notes are a lot better. And that leads us to tip number 7, social graphics. Having someone listen to your podcast opens up even more doors than maybe you had even considered. Because, I mean, let's face it, you don't want to go back and listen to that old podcast, right? You already did it. It's boring. Even if it's something from years ago, it's a little cringeworthy now, right? You're going to be saying, oh, I wish I'd asked that question, or I wish I hadn't stumbled or stuttered right at that section. Have someone else listen to your podcast notes, because we can pull out the smartest quotes that you or your guests had. Now, what does that give us? Well, we can post just the quote on its own on Twitter and Facebook. That's nice. But we can create beautiful square graphics that you can post on places like Instagram or LinkedIn, where it's bright colors, it's attention getting, it has a picture of your guest and maybe even you too. It has in large print, the name of your podcast, the title of your podcast, maybe even your guest's website address. That way they will be motivated to share it as well. But imagine that if a guest just showed up on your show and you had some really good moments that had come and gone because you're in the moment talking to the person, and our team creates a graphic and whoa, they said that really cool quote, that sentence, and maybe even we reworded it, beefed it up so it's even better than what they had and what they said in the moment, and it's like what they had meant to say, right? And we have this social graphic that now we can post on a schedule again and again. And there are even things called audiograms, where if you only have audio, you can just find a clip, and it's just like one of those like waveforms that's kind of moving around and has the picture, the photo of your guest, and just plays the audio. But even with podcast notes, even if you have like a full video setup like what we have here, because someone listens to your podcast, we can find just an easy 30-second or 60-second clip that we can chop out, and now you can use it on Facebook or on LinkedIn or on Instagram, all these places where people are just scrolling on their phones and maybe even burn subtitles. And you've seen this, right? Where you're scrolling and you see like a 3-minute video and you're like, okay, well, I'm on my phone, but I have 3 minutes to listen or to watch this, but I'm also on a phone and I'm muted or I'm out and about. You see the captions burned in. And when you do this, now you're getting even more bang for your buck on top of bang for your buck, because you can and you should be adding your podcast guests on Facebook and on LinkedIn, and then tagging them when you do post the link to your show, tagging them when you do post the quote, tagging them when you post the social graphic, tagging them when you post the video clip or the audiogram. So are you beginning to see that you can create a podcast episode one time and enjoy benefits from it forever, right? Maybe in little doses from this social post and that social post and that email and that tweet, but so many things piling up for months or years to come. Which brings us to tip number 8, piece of advice number 8, appear on other podcasts. You're stuck in a bubble. And I know of a few podcasters who have hundreds and hundreds of episodes, but they're still frustrated that the traffic isn't quite increasing. Well, the answer is for you to get out of your bubble a little bit and appear on other podcasts. And it's easy to do. You have a bio. You already know how to be on a podcast. You already know how to talk. And with many of these podcasts you can appear on, you can do a little swap, right? You can say, I'll appear on your show if you appear on my show. And this also combines with all of the fun strategies that we've already been speaking about. Do you know that we can make podcast notes for shows that you yourself have appeared on? Think about this. We can go and find the episode where your successful interview was published. We can make podcast notes for this episode. And then you can go to that show host and you can say, hey, I had notes made. Here you go. And that's your way to follow up with them. You can create a post on your own blog linking to your podcast interview or embedding the player, because some guests allow you to do that, and then have the notes underneath that. So you rank for all these search engine results. You can create the social graphics, so that way you can post on social media and route people to your guest appearance. And so you can see how you can appear on other podcasts and then follow up with podcast notes or social graphics. That was tip number 8. Appear on other podcasts and follow up with podcast notes or social graphics. Tip number 9. This is a fun outside the box one. Did you know that it's easier than ever to get a book published? These are all my books, and some of them can be just very quick and easy. So imagine if you looked back at your most recent 10 or 12 podcast episodes and you say, there was just one episode where it's not that lengthy, but it was a really good episode and a lot of interesting content crammed in there. Like, one client in particular comes to mind who is a medical doctor, and around the holidays, he re-promotes an old podcast episode that says, here's how to manage the holiday stress and the holiday weight, and kind of how to maintain your health during the holidays, including exercise and diet, limited diet, right? How to deal with the gorging on Thanksgiving and Christmas, but also keep your weight under control, and do a little bit of exercise even though you might be over at grandma's house, and how to keep your mind sane with all of the holiday stress. So what if you just made a quick 30-40 page booklet out of one of your successful podcast episodes? What if you took maybe a handful of your podcast episode and made a book that was kind of your best content? Or what if you did what we did here, where you contact many of the guests that are on your show over time and offer and say, well, here's the price for having a chapter in my book, and they pay you in order to get their podcast conversation transcribed into a chapter where there are multiple authors in one book. And that's not an offer for everyone, but think about how amazing how this is for some people, for the right people. They wanted more traffic, they wanted more exposure, they appeared on your show, and now as a bonus for a slightly more money, now they are a published author with their picture and their name, and they get to have a chapter with all these other podcast guests, and all they had to do was show up and have a 10-20 minute conversation with you. Tip number 10. Follow up with past guests for more content. This is really easy, right? I mean, I'm assuming that you have some kind of a list or a spreadsheet of episode 7 was Jimmy, episode 8 was Alice, and you can go through and email each of these people. And again, our team can do this, or even if you just did this to 3-5 guests a day and said, hey, I really enjoyed you being on my show. Here's a link. Can you record a quick 10 or 15 minute clip on your computer or on your phone, and even just like email me the video or something, and we will add that as another podcast episode. So they already took the time to meet with you and talk to you for 20-30 minutes for their original episode. Maybe that was 2 years ago now. And now they can send in a new 10-15 minute clip. They can do it on their own time. They don't have to meet with you. Just send in a new clip, and that becomes a new episode. And this is great if your podcast has died, right? Let's say you did 50 episodes 5 years ago. Email all 50 people one at a time. Just do a handful a day, and you can get it done this week, and ask them all, can you record a quick clip for me, just updating us on what's changed since your last episode? And maybe only 5 of them do it. Well, guess what? That's 5 episodes you did not have to do. And you can go back and get the notes created, get the clips, and get more and more traffic from free and paid sources. Tip number 11. Create 60-second thank you videos for guests or listeners. Think about how easy this is. And probably even if you went back and looked at their photo or looked at the email chain that happened between you and them over those weeks when they were on your show, maybe something reminded you of them, or maybe an easy thing you can do is even find a news article that relates to them or relates to something they said and say, hey, I was just thinking about you. Here's a news article or something new happening in the industry. Create a quick 60-second thank you video for your guests or your listeners. And even if you don't know what to say besides, thanks for hopping on my show, it was great to connect with you, that alone is more than most people do. Most people will not even lift a finger for their podcast guests. Well, now you can stand out. And if you want to get even crazier, you can and you should research other things about your guests. Add them on social media, sign up to their email list, see if they themselves have podcasts or books, and see what they need, because authors especially, if someone has a book, they need more reviews. And if you bought their book, especially if it was free on Kindle, or if you maybe even ask them for a copy or just go flat out buy a copy, find something interesting in their book and then go to their Amazon page, leave a review, and that is more than most people do in their entire lifetime to help anyone else they meet in business or in internet marketing. And bonus points, if you have your existing podcast set up, like we've been talking about, like your camera, why not get their book, hold their book on camera, record it, and then post the video on their Amazon page? Very few Amazon authors have a video review, even one. Now you can be the one to do it. Now you can be their hero. Tip number 12, get someone to manage some of this. Get someone to manage everything we've been discussing today. We discussed podcast notes, editing and uploading, lead generation, research of your past guests. We can do lead generation and research to get guests for you. We can do lead generation and research for you to get on other shows. But out of all the things that you could be doing, my advice, my default go-to is for you to start off with us with some podcast notes. Go to dfypodcast.com and click on the show notes tab, because we want you to try us out. Find your most recent podcast episode or your favorite podcast episode, or maybe even an upcoming episode. Give us the audio and see what we come back with, because what we will come back with is a fully fleshed out blog post that you can then use to perhaps edit down or think about a book, even a quick one. You can use those notes to give to your guests. You can use them for social graphics. You can use them for video clips, and you can use them to rank better and get more traffic on the search engines. Those were 12 ideas and 12 things you can and should be doing with your podcast, and start with one of them. Start slow. Don't get yourself overwhelmed. I like to think about it like being out of shape, like maybe you haven't exercised in a long time and it's time to get back in there. Don't set yourself up for failure. Don't self-sabotage. Instead, ease back into it. There was a reason why you started your podcast in the first place. At one point, you were excited about it. What the heck happened? Maybe life got in the way. Maybe you think back and you cringe a little bit thinking about, I let a month pass. I let a year pass. It's okay. I don't think anyone will notice. Go back and record a quick 5 or 10 minute video or audio, post it, give us the notes, follow up with your past guests. Think about a quick tool or resource or situation that you can help people with and make your podcast the best it can be. We said tip number 1, post consistently. Tip number 2, get guests on your podcast. Tip number 3, get on video. Tip number 4, post to additional platforms like YouTube. Tip number 5, re-promote at least one old episode per week. Tip number 6, create podcast notes. We can do it at dfypodcast.com. Tip number 7, create social graphics with important quotes from the podcast episode. Tip number 8, appear on other podcasts. Tip number 9, create a mini book or a compilation book based on your best content. Tip number 10, follow up with past guests for more content. Tip number 11, create a 60-second thank you video for your guests or even your listeners. Just create some 60-second thank you videos for individual people. And tip number 12, get someone to manage some, if not eventually, all of this. That way, your podcast works consistently, and that way you get the fun and the magic back. I'm Robert Plank from dfypodcast.com. We'll talk to you soon about making your podcast the best it can be, managing it, running it on autopilot, and getting you the reach that you need and deserve. Robert Plank, dfypodcast.com. Did you leave us a quick review on iTunes yet? It's quick and easy. Just go to marketeroftheday.com/iTunes, click the View in iTunes button, and we would be very grateful.